what might make one vulnerable to imposter syndrome, what might protect against imposter syndrome, and what advice do you have for those individuals who might be experiencing this?
I would say any major transition is a potential trigger for imposter feelings. Being in a new environment, being in a new academic type of environment can absolutely be a trigger for this. So being in a PhD program, where being in medical school, being in very rigorous academic contexts, where that rigor seems to be like a normal part of the culture, that where everybody else appears to be managing that well, where folks are not clearly communicating their struggles around this. So there isn't like an honest community about what people are actually feeling and going through, helps to exacerbate this as well. So if you're in an environment just with any transition, marry that to the fact that people aren't openly and freely being vulnerable about how much they are struggling too, can create this context where you may feel like you are the only one who's uniquely struggling in the environment. And so those feelings of kind of not being good enough, for some folks, not feeling worthy of the opportunity, can also show up as being some of the roots of imposter feelings that may be appearing for folks in this context that they did not experience prior. So it's kind of all of those things mixed together can create this stew where this is highly likely for people to experience this. And I think your first question was what makes folks vulnerable, and the second was
what are some of the protective factors? But before we get there, I wanted to echo what you just said, because the not talking about it really isolates people and makes them feel as if they're the only one. And I heard that repeatedly. And I was privy to that from so many people that I realized it was a part of the culture and the context. You know, lots of times people within a particular age group or within a particular culture may feel strange talking about these things. They may feel as though they're outing themselves, or they may feel some degree of shame. So it's hard to talk about. And the other thing that I have realized is that social media can either worsen or help. So it can worsen if what's being presented is a false image of positives only. It can help if people are actually being vocal about the struggles that they're having, and there's a community that forms around them and it's supportive. Mm-hmm. So it depends on kind of where you're going for support, whether through social media or in life. But this is something that I've heard often. So I appreciated that you said that not being in a space where it's not openly acknowledged, talked about, processed, can exacerbate the feelings. Now, let's talk about the vulnerabilities from an Afro-Caribbean perspective. We may not be able to get very much in depth on this, but just a few things here I think might be helpful for individuals who are listening in, especially for those who are making the transition, who are in the midst of the transition themselves, as well as protective factors, because I do believe that there are things that uniquely protect us from experiencing these things when we make the transition.
Some of the vulnerabilities may have to do with, you know, really a lot of things that may warrant like a healthy level of self-doubt too. Lack of resources, perhaps. For a lot of folks that struggle with worthiness of an opportunity and feel like they have to show and prove that they're worthy of this opportunity that they've been given, this scholarship, this shot, this what have you, that can be sometimes a unique vulnerability for folks coming from developing countries. For a lot of African Americans who are also maybe contending with race on top of this and how those enmesh, meaning struggling with how they're being perceived racially and what that means in terms of their competence people's trust in them and all of those things, and how that kind of complicates your experience of imposter phenomenon, that can be a protective factor for Afro-Caribbean people who aren't coming in with that per se, weren't coming in with that extra layer of entanglement of that. Because there's certainly a lot of coaches that I may work with that are African-American folks who are carrying that. They're like, and I have to show and prove because I'm a Black woman doing XYZ, ABC, and perhaps Afro-Caribbean people who are fresh off the soil aren't necessarily coming in with all of that, with that aspect layered on top of it. Now, some people may have really good friends that are able to do some of that for you, meaning like help to ground and center your thinking. But, your friend is not your coach or your therapist, right? So oftentimes with friends trying to be empathetic, oftentimes there might be, that can be counterproductive, right? So some friends may actually, in their attempt to be empathetic, miss the empathy and actually get into things along the lines of either judgment of the person and what's going on, or let me fix it for you, or you think that's bad? I've dealt with that too. Here's my worst story. There may be one-upmanship. All of those things are counterproductive, and that can happen. So relying on friends and family for support in this area is a very slippery slope. Ideally, you want to work with a professional on this. And if it's really a coaching need and not a therapeutic need, you can break through very quickly and get to a place of at least increased awareness very quickly.